All right, well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here and presenting to this crowd that what we're going to see about dinosaurs today. Particularly, we're going to look at two dinosaurs that might be mentioned in the Bible, Behemoth and Leviathan. And we're going to start a little bit with a little introduction about dinosaurs, first of all. What are dinosaurs? And kind of some myths that dinosaurs have been taught in the secular world. Some kind of about things where they don't tell you the truth. So we'll look at a couple of myths first, a little bit about dinosaurs, why they're not listed as the word dinosaur in the Bible. And then we'll talk about these two creatures that are described in the book of Job, Job 40 and 41. What does the Bible say? Well, it doesn't mention the word dinosaur, but it does mention on day 6 that God created the beasts of the earth according to its kind. So God created all the animals, including the dinosaurs. We do find their bones. And so the dinosaurs would be included in that beast of the earth. Secondly, dinosaurs are created to eat plants, just like all animals. So the original creation before Adam and Eve sinned, before the fall as we call it, all animals ate plants. So in Genesis 1:30 it says, also to every beast of the earth I have given every green herb for food. So even T-Rexes, which we'll talk about today with their big teeth, 6-inch teeth, sometimes even bigger, there must have been some type of plant that they ate and designed to eat that plant by God. But why aren't dinosaurs in the Bible? A lot of people wonder about dinosaurs. There's people that scoff that dinosaurs didn't really exist. But when you find the bones, you can see they really did exist. And when you read through some of the literature, and even in God's Word in the book of Job, you see a pretty good description about what probably was a dinosaur. And that's what we'll talk about later today. But why aren't dinosaurs in the Bible? Well, the main reason is the Bible wasn't translated into English, especially the Old Testament, until 1611 with the King James Bible. And the word dinosaur didn't come along until 1841. So you're looking over 200 years later, 250 years or so later, this happy-looking fellow over there, Sir Richard Owen. In the 19th century, that's what you did. You kind of posed and sat there for a long time, and he sat there longer. And by the time he got done, you were kind of grumpy, so that's why they never smiled much. Everything was black and white back then from coal dust and coal soot. But a dinosaur actually was defined by Sir Richard Owen in 1841 as an animal that walked erect, a reptile that walked erect. So its legs come straight down from the body. Whereas lizards, most reptiles we have today, crocodiles, alligators, and things, they sprawl. And so the legs come up from the body sideways. So you can tell by the hip structure there's holes in the hips, just like we have holes in our hips. And so the sockets of the femur actually fit right in. Whether they're two-legged or four-legged animals, their legs came down erect. And that's what made a dinosaur different. So he defined that by just a few specimens they had in 1841. It's rather remarkable that he was able to identify that. But he was the world's renowned anatomist. And by the way, he fought against Darwin's theory of evolution until the day he died. And he was the most renowned anatomist at the time. Dinosaurs definitely then were on the ark because God told Noah every animal will be on the ark. He said, creatures that moved along the ground, 2 of every kind, in Genesis 6. So on the ark, he didn't exclude any animals. So if he created the beasts of the earth, which include the dinosaurs, he would have brought them on the ark. Genesis 7:21-23 says, everything on land perished that had breath of life. So if you weren't on the ark, and there were pairs of each type of dinosaur, or each kind of dinosaur on the ark, we'll talk about the numbers you needed, you were dead and drowned or buried by day 150 of the flood. And that's the talk I'll talk about a little bit on Friday. I'll give my flood talk and my evidence of the flood in a little bit more detail if you do come back. And that was the day 150 he's referring to in Genesis 7. Noah's Ark was very, very large. This is kind of a minimal estimate size. The Bible talks about cubits. And if a cubit was, I think, 18 inches, you get about 450 feet long, which is a football field and a half long. So it's pretty big, 75 feet wide and 45 feet high. So it's a very, very large, really a large barge is really what it was. It wasn't really a sailing vessel. It was just a large barge to store 2 of every kind on there. And there was plenty of room for even more people to get on. Noah preached and preached for years, the 80 to 100 years that he was building the ark. He preached to everybody that came by, told them there's going to be a flood, told them what God told him. And yet only Noah, his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives got on the ark. There was room for probably hundreds, if not maybe even 1,000 more people easily could have been on that ark, and all the food for all those people. The door was open for decades, the door of salvation for anybody that wanted to get on the ark. But yet only Noah and his immediate family heeded that warning that the judgment was coming. Just like today, Christ opened that door of salvation for us by his death on the cross. Jesus died on the cross. God himself took on human flesh to be that perfect sacrifice. He finished it once and for all. That death on the cross opens up that door of salvation for us. So while we're alive on earth, we just have to make that decision. God's calling us. We just have to answer the call and walk through that door of salvation. So it's very similar to the ark. The ark was salvation at the time of Noah. Christ is salvation today. Dinosaurs fit on the ark pretty easily, I think, because even though the average size of dinosaur was about the size of a bison or a buffalo, we actually did the math to determine this a few years ago, Jeff Tompkins and I. We determined the average size was about the size of an adult dinosaur. Anyway, it was about the size of a bison. There were small dinosaurs and big dinosaurs. But this is about the average size. But on the ark, God probably brought juveniles, animals that could reproduce again after they got off the ark very quickly and easily. And so smaller, juvenile, teenage-type animals would probably fit best on the ark before they go through the growth spurt. And there's really only about 60 kinds of dinosaurs out there. There's just a lot of varieties of those kinds. Just like you look around the room here today, there's lots of varieties of us. We have different colored hair and skin color and eye color, height, size, width. I think I'm getting wider as I get older. I don't know what that has to do with it, but that might be overeating. But dinosaurs, there's only about 60 basic kinds, maybe 70. So you have to bring about 120 to maybe 140 dinosaurs on the ark. And they were probably averaging about sheep-sized if they were juveniles, not even bison-sized. So you wouldn't bring the 131-foot long-necked sauropods on the ark, I don't believe. The smaller ones, the ones that were maybe 20 feet or 10 feet. So easily, the dinosaurs could fit on the ark, along with all the other animals. And one of our books that we sell is a study by John Woodmarappy, showing that all the food, all the water, all the animals could easily fit on the ark. And he even put on about double or triple the amount of dinosaurs than you really needed, I believe. But we're going to take a little pause here before I get to Leviathan and Behemoth and talk a bit about some of these evolutionary myths that you hear in the movies and on the TV shows and the Discovery Channel and all these different things out there. Evolutionary myths about dinosaurs that you might hear. And we're going to dispel some of those myths, kind of destroy them a little bit and show the real truth. Many people will talk about dinosaurs were buried slowly. You read through your textbooks. When I was a geology student, there's textbooks that talk about dinosaurs dying, animals dying, and then they slowly get buried by layers of mud over a year or a couple years' time, and then by some miraculous occurrence over millions of years, they become fossils. Well, the truth is far different than that. The truth is animals that are fossilized are buried very fast. And even now, some of the secular scientists are admitting this. Mary Schweitzer was here a few years ago. She spoke about this. She studied the soft tissues in T-Rexes. We'll talk about a little bit later. But she said that fossils have to be formed fast, and buried deep, because you got to cut off the oxygen supply as well. So there's a level of depth that has to be acquired as well, not just the very, very fast. So the flood, of course, provides that perfect opportunity for all these fossils that we see. And we see dinosaurs are in bone beds. When I used to dig in Wyoming, these are some of the bones we were digging on. You see they're just bones laying on top of each other, almost like a log jam of bones. And they're all torn apart. Very rarely do you find a complete dinosaur, or even a partially complete dinosaur. And they're mostly just individual bones. They had to kind of piece them together after many years of digging. And so the bone beds may only be this thick, and they may cover something the size of this room. There'll be thousands of bones of all different animals and teeth. And eventually you have to piece them all together. That's why some of the reconstructions of our dinosaurs are wrong. And we also rename the dinosaurs without knowing it, because we find different bones and all this. And then we realize later that this was all the same dinosaur. Or they might be juveniles of the same type, and there's still debate about that. All right, we're looking at a juvenile of a different one. And so even some of the secular scientists say that 40% of the dinosaurs we have today are probably just juveniles of adult ones and vice versa. And so with the dinosaur numbers out there, there's over 1,000 species named, but there's really, again, only about 60 kinds of dinosaurs. And they're buried so rapidly that often these waves that came in from the ocean were bringing in marine fossils. And we find a lot of dinosaurs mixed in not only marine fossils, but also in marine rocks. We find dinosaurs in limestone. We find dinosaurs washed out to sea. There's the example of one of the dinosaurs washed out off Norway I wrote about in one of the Acts and Facts articles. You can look it up online, about a dinosaur off Norway, about 70 miles off Norway. They found it by drilling an oil well in the North Sea. They pulled up a core, and in that core had a bone of a Plateosaurus dinosaur. And it was about a mile down. So they're 70 miles offshore, a mile buried deep in the sediment, there was a dinosaur. And so dinosaurs and plants and also lots of marine fossils are all mixed together, and that's what we see all over the world. Everywhere I look, from India to Europe to South America to North America, as I study the geology across all these different continents, I'm seeing the same patterns over and over and over. The pattern is there. The fingerprint of the global flood is right there before us. And this is one of the evidences, the mixing of land and marine rocks and marine fossils. And if you look at the Hell Creek Formation, where most of our T-Rexes are found in North America, up in Montana, eastern Montana, they've now found 6 species of sharks in that same layer. And actually shark teeth right with where they pulled out Tyrannosaurus rex Sioux, who you'll see in just a moment. One of the largest T-Rexes ever discovered. Fossil shark teeth. Now the secular scientists have to argue, well, these are, freshwater sharks. And they find rays and they find herring and all these things mixed in. They say, oh, these are freshwater fish. And they constantly have to backtrack up from what we see living today. We see very few freshwater sharks. We see very few freshwater herring. We see very few freshwater coelacanths. But they find coelacanths with spinosaurs and they go, well, it must have been a freshwater fish back when the dinosaurs were alive. But today we find it 500 feet down in the ocean. 500 feet down in the ocean. It's not at the surface at all. And so it looks identical to what we see in the fossil record. So why don't we believe that these are marine fish? And so even when we find marine fossils, these secular scientists often will twist it around and say, oh, they must have been freshwater back then because they're found with dinosaurs. That's total circular reasoning and justifying what is not really there. So all these different critters are all mixed together. You get land animals mixed together with marine critters. We see immediate death positions, fish eating fish, buried instantly. Again, rapid burial is the rule. We even see examples like this, the live birth of Ichthyosaurs. You can see this, a swimming marine reptile. And this swimming marine reptile actually didn't lay eggs because they didn't crawl on land like turtles do. God designed this to lay live birth in the water. And this little animal had to swim up and get its first breath, just like the dolphins do and the mammals that we see today. But this was a reptile. His tail is not broke. That's the way the tail back fin kind of bends down, and then the fleshy part goes up. And so we used to think the tail was broke on these, but they're really not. Very, very rapid burial. This is my favorite and probably one of the most outstanding fossils ever discovered of dinosaurs. This is the fighting fossils found in Mongolia by a Polish expedition, I believe, in the 70s. And here we have a Velociraptor, which is the one laying sideways with this big tail sticking back. With the arm of the Velociraptor is in the mouth of a Protoceratops. And even after the fall, this was still a plant eater. After the fall, we think Velociraptor was a meat eater. But originally, again, God designed them as plant eaters. But they started eating meat after Adam and Eve sinned. But you can see the arm is right in the mouth like a trapped rat. The rat's going to bite at you, even though rats don't eat humans. Well, I guess they could. But normally, this thing's not going to eat a Velociraptor. But it's got its mouth protecting itself with its powerful bite. So these big frills on this thing pulled back the muscles and made a really strong bite for these Ceratopsians, these Protoceratops type dinosaurs. And so it's about to bite down on the Velociraptor, and they got buried instantly by a big sand wave. It's a life assemblage, they call it. Instant burial, just like two wrestlers in the ring, WWE wrestlers going at it, get them in a chokehold, and they get buried instantly. And they're frozen in that position for thousands of years until they were dug up by that Polish expedition. But here it is, literally about to bite down and probably snap the arm and break the bones in the Velociraptor to protect itself. And it was just frozen instantly in that burial. That's how rapid the burial really was. There's nothing slow about fossils. Dinosaurs are buried rapidly, probably even faster than this with the more massive waves. You got to think of tsunami waves that were 300 feet high, 400 feet high, 500 feet high. Waves so big and so incredible that we witnessed nothing like it ever since the flood. And that's why we make the flood small. We can't imagine a flood that was global. But it just kept coming and coming and coming. And you can see the globe in our Discovery Center here where we kind of show in 2 minutes what happened to the Earth, how it was flooded bit by bit by bit over 150 days up to the last level. Here I am digging, get it a little plastered up here all over my hands. It takes the hair off you as you're doing it. But this is how you dig up the fossils when you're doing dinosaur digging. But fossils don't take a long time. They don't even take a long time to form. They don't take millions of years to form. They can form within 90 days. You can start to petrify things. All you need is the right conditions, and the flood gives us those conditions all over the world. Secondly, dinosaurs are often told, we're told many times that dinosaurs had all these ancestors. Different dinosaur, of course, has to have an ancestor. We had ancestors, but they look similar to us. Well, the secular evolutionists believe they look different, but they don't know where dinosaurs really came from. They're still trying to figure out what the ancestor of dinosaurs actually was. But if you look at individual kinds of dinosaurs, they don't even know where those came from, as we'll see. So let's look at the Ceratopsians. Again, this is sort of a cousin to the ones we just saw, Protoceratops, but this is Triceratops. It had a solid frill and big horns. That's my daughter when she was much younger. I think she's turning 30 next month, so she's a little older than that today. But that's just for scale. They had one of the largest heads of all dinosaurs. But do they have ancestors in the rock record? Where do we find things that look like this? Well, we see lots of variety again, and God probably would have had to bring a pair of these on to give us all that variety. All the horns of all different shapes, all different angles, 2 horns, no horns, kind of rough, bumpy horns. All these different things were probably parts of these individual family units. Just like your family looks a little different from most families. You know, the kids that you have look more like you and your spouse than anybody else, but possibly your grandparents. But again, God loves diversity because he made a lot of diversity, not only in humans, but in all creatures that he created, like the dinosaurs. But if you look at the rocks, see, most of our Triceratops type animals are found in Cretaceous rocks, actually towards the top even, very, very top. That's where they were buried in the flood at this level. Now, we don't believe in these years. These are just there because that's the secular years. We left them in there for reference. But there's nothing down here below those levels where we find other dinosaurs. We don't see anything. See, there's no direct ancestors at all. There's nothing that looks like a Protoceratops or a Triceratops in those levels. They just show up suddenly, fully formed, with horns and frills. There's nothing below at all, whatsoever. If we look at the T-Rex, this is Tyrannosaurus rex Sioux, which I talked about earlier. They found Sioux, and right in that same rock layer, literally right underneath where they dug it out, they find shark teeth and other marine clams and things. And here's Sioux in Chicago. I think they moved her or him or whatever it was. They're not really sure if it's a him or a her. That's another talk in itself, but this is one of the largest T-Rexes ever discovered. So does it have ancestors? Well, I got a chance to dig on a T-Rex in Montana back around the year 2000, so I was much younger then as well. Some of you were too. But there's a tooth. You can see the way they dig up the teeth. This was only about a 25-foot T-Rex. Now the one in Chicago, of course, is about a 41-foot T-Rex. So that's a larger, older one. But this one is more of a juvenile size, maybe even an older juvenile. But when you look at the rock layers again, T-Rexes are found, again, same rocks almost as Triceratops, up here in the top of the Cretaceous. We look down here, do we see anything that resembles a T-Rex? And there's nothing. There's no ancestors to the T-Rex. They're still trying to find ancestors to the Triceratops and the T-Rex. And in fact, all dinosaurs, they can't find ancestors to any of them. So the rocks should tell the story, yet the rocks tell us these things just show up. Suddenly, fully formed, at the level they were buried in the flood. As the waters got higher and higher, they buried different animals, different plants, different types of animals, different dinosaurs even, as you go through the dinosaur rock layers. So the dinosaurs are always found in these 3 layers that secular scientists have identified. We use the names, but we don't use the years. We think those are not correct either. Here's the summary of that. David Weisample from Johns Hopkins University, who's looked at more dinosaurs probably than anybody on Earth, because he helped write the Dinosauria. He says, from my reading of the fossil record of dinosaurs, no direct ancestors have been discovered for any dinosaur species. So here he admits that there's no ancestors to any of them. Alas, my list of dinosaurian ancestors is an empty one. Now we're going to talk about this little critter down here as a possibility for Leviathan here in a minute. But look how much bigger it is than a human. So humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time, but I'm seeing in my research that they might have lived in separate areas for that obvious reason, that they had big teeth. And they were much bigger than most humans. It appears dinosaurs kept growing throughout their lifetime. And so the ones that were the biggest ones were probably hundreds of years old. But let's look at the last one. Dinosaurs are supposed to be millions of years old. We talked about this earlier. We don't believe those years, and here's why. They're supposed to be around 66 million to about 232 million, and that number changes a little bit here and there. And they're supposed to be evolved into birds and all this kind of stuff, which we don't have time to get into in this talk. But let's look at the age question. What we're finding in dinosaurs since the year 2005, and actually go back before that, there's papers that show they found these earlier, but in 2005 it made the news. It was on 60 Minutes. It made a big splash. And Mary Schweitzer found that in about a 68 million year old dinosaur, as they called it, 70 million years old, depending on who's counting, they found original tissues, original proteins. And this little white strip here, if you watch that video clip, is actually stretchy, almost like a rubber band. So they dissolved away all the bone, too much bone by accident, and found all these original red-looking blobs and white stretchy things. And they realized that they did more and more studies and more studies. These are original proteins, original cells from dinosaurs. And they found what looked like red blood cells in the blood vessels. They still don't call them red blood cells. They just say they're red blood cell-like. But the blood vessels they've identified, they've concluded they found those. But physical chemists will show you that these organic compounds, like collagen, what makes up most of your skin and your saddles. And you guys are Texans here. You all rode your horses into the Discovery Center today, and you rode on a leather saddle. Well, that leather saddle is collagen. But if you leave a leather saddle out in your shed or in your barn for 50 years, what's going to happen to it? It's going to dry out and start to break up and decay, just like leather does. Leather doesn't last forever either because it's made out of collagen. But imagine trying to preserve it for 68 million years. It's virtually impossible. And the scientists have said that. Many scientists still won't admit these proteins and these blood vessels like this exist. Here's osteocyte cells, bone-making cells right here. Still original. You can see those black dots are what appear to be the red blood cells, and there's a blood vessel they discovered in 2017. They actually admitted openly that we have blood vessels that are still flexible. Just like ours are when we bend our arms, our blood vessels are still flexible as well. So you find all these original proteins and blood vessels and cells, and here's osteocyte cells. You can see the little orange dots in there. That's the nucleus. You can see blood vessels, and it looks like red blood cells in them. And the red blood cells have nucleus in reptiles, unlike ours where our nucleus falls out. We have no nucleus. These are not human red blood cells. These are reptile blood cells, just like we'd expect to find in a dinosaur. So it's all these original proteins. There's been 70 papers now. I think we're up to about 85. I need to update my talk. Dr. Brian Thomas, who's keeping track of this, has found about 85 papers now that have found original proteins as far back in the geologic record as 500 million years and beyond. So 500 million years now, they're supposed to have survived miraculously all that time and still be flexible little worms. It's beyond belief. And so it takes more faith to believe in evolution than it does to believe God's word. So hopefully we're going to move on to Leviathan and Behemoth, but there's some evolutionary myths I wanted to bust first that you hear all the time in the movies. Constantly, you'll go to Jurassic Park movies and they'll talk about 60-some million years ago and 70 million years ago, and they throw these numbers out there like they're real. But when you look at the real rock data, what's in the fossils, what's in those bones, you find out it's impossible for these things to be that old. They have to be thousands of years old. It's amazing they're even 4,500 years old. If you follow the biblical genealogies, that's about what you get for the flood, about 4,500 years ago. That's a lot more believable when you see what's found in those bones with those soft tissues. But let's look at a little bit about humans and dinosaurs. People don't believe dinosaurs and humans coexisted after the flood, or before the flood for that matter. But here we find some texts after the flood, ancient texts and pictures. There actually was a lot of evidence of human and dinosaur interaction. Here's the Narmer palette, and you can look at this in this red area right here. You see two Egyptians roping around two big long-necked animals that walked erect. These are not sprawling reptiles. They have long necks, long tails, just like a long-necked dinosaur would have, and legs coming straight down, just what you'd expect. The Mesopotamian cylinder. in the Louvre, Paris. You roll it out, this is what you see. Take the cylinder and roll out what it shows. You see the same sort of thing the Egyptians saw, long-necked animals that walked erect with long tails. Very, very similar to what we find in the fossil record for these sauropod or long-necked dinosaurs. And then in our Discovery Center, you can see a rendition of this wall right over there. I think I took a picture of our wall, the life-size wall from Cambodia about the 12th century. I found this a couple decades ago. But on one of them, you see, down below you see, I think at the bottom is a lion. And then you see some other lizard-type animal. And there's a water buffalo, and there's a monkey. And in the middle of it all, you see this, which looks almost identical to a stegosaurus, with the plate sticking up on its back. So whatever this animal is, since the rest of them are real, we assume this was real too. And this real animal looks a lot like a stegosaurus. Now again, is this proof? No, but it sure does indicate there might have been some dinosaur-looking animals that the Egyptians saw, the Mesopotamian people saw, the Cambodians saw just hundreds of years ago, if not thousands of years ago. So let's look at the Bible. The Bible also seems to describe some dinosaurs. And in Job 40 particularly, it talks about this animal called a behemoth, where the Hebrew scholars, or the scholars of Hebrew, they were translating the Bible, didn't know what this was. They just left the Hebrew word. They weren't sure what it was describing because in 1611, 1610, when they were working at 1608 through 1611, they had no idea what this animal was. So they finally just left it. The same thing is true of Leviathan, we'll see in the next one. They don't know what it was because they didn't have the word dinosaur yet. If they would translate it today, you could throw in the word dinosaur here, which would be much more fitting as you'll see. But in Job 40, God's pointing out to Job, behold now behemoth, which I made with you. Well, if you look at the creation week, day 6 was the day God made all the land animals, and then he made Adam. So it was the day. So he says, when I made with you, he's referring back probably to creation. But God's talking about the same day I made Adam, I made the land animals. And so sauropods seem to fit the description of a behemoth, as we'll see. This is a long-necked sauropod, probably the one that wasn't on the ark, obviously, because they found the fossils of this. They found about 40% of this, and this is a replica in plastic. If they had found the whole thing, how big it might have been. I didn't even get the tail on my picture. But this is really a picture of my daughter. So this dinosaur just got in the way. But it's 131 feet long, found in New Mexico. This is Seismosaurus. And so you can look that up if you're interested. It's found in the Jurassic rocks. Rocks a little bit below the T-Rex and the Triceratops I talked about earlier. But sauropods, or the long-necked dinosaurs, all had very unique features that God designed for these things to operate correctly. And of course, there's no ancestors to these in the rocks below either. They just show up fully formed, long necks, long tails, just like they were buried that way. But they all had to have a large body size. They had to have four-legged stance, because if you got a long neck and a long tail, you got to have a pretty sturdy base. And so they're all four-legged or quadrupeds. And God designed them with a very small head. So at the end of these big, long necks, you see a very small head. If they had a big head, they're just going to lay down all day. Can't lift their head up. But God designed it with a very small head. They just ate a lot all day long. They had 10 or more neck bones, which is more than any animal today. Some of them had 20 or more neck bones, and they had 20 or more tail bones to kind of balance it all out. They balanced around those 4 legs, those hips. And they had elongate neck bones in addition to the number of neck bones. But God also designed the vertebrae in the neck and the tail to be hollow. Knowing that there'd be these big long tails and necks that were going to be very heavy if they were solid, he made them hollow. And so these animals have solid leg bones, but they had hollowed out neck and tail bones. And yet in the fossil record, there's no evidence of any of these. They just show up fully formed in the rocks below the Jurassic levels. The Bible goes on and says, he eats grass like an ox in Job 40:15. And many secular scientists and even a lot of Christians say, well, it can't be a dinosaur because in our fossil record, we don't find grass until rocks above the dinosaurs. So obviously dinosaurs didn't eat grass. This can't be a dinosaur. But yet in 2005, they found in India, dinosaurs were in fact eating 5 types of grass. So in the dinosaur dung found with these long-necked sauropods, they actually found in the dung, they studied the dung, did thin sections of the dinosaur dung, and they found all these different types of grasses. So in fact, dinosaurs, sauropods in particular, long-necked dinosaurs in particular, which we think Behemoth probably was in fact eating grass. So they had to go back and change all their paintings, all their drawings. I told a person who was up there talking about this at a T-Rex exhibit when this just came out, and they were showing this painting of T-Rex, and they said, there's no grass here in the Cretaceous because it didn't evolve yet. And I told the lady afterwards, I said, well, you got to look at this paper. So I sent her a link to it later, and she was like, oh, thanks. So I said, now we got to change our whole talk because the finding shows there really was grass in the Cretaceous, and probably before. It's just hard to fossilize grass. But like horses, again, you guys rode horses, you're Texans. You look at the dung, you can see what the horse ate. You can see what the dinosaurs ate as well if you find the dung. All right, moving on. See now, his strength is in his hips. And you can see these dinosaurs had tremendously strong hips, that erect posture. Of course, God had to design these so they could hold all that weight. Some of these dinosaurs were 40 tons, 40 metric tons, which is a little bigger than our U.S. tons even. Tremendously large animals as they grew bigger and bigger, and they had tremendous stomachs. His power is in his stomach muscles, God says in Job 40. And so here we see the dinosaurs, many of them actually had coprolites that they would lose their gastroliths in. These rounded stones are part of their gizzard stones. And there's a coprolite up there that has once in a while they'd pass one of their gizzard stones out through their gizzard. God designed these with gizzards. Just like some of the birds, the chickens and stuff. When I was a kid, we used to feed oyster shells to our chickens because they needed it for their gizzard to grind up their food. Well, dinosaurs only had teeth in the front. Many of the sauropods, they just had front teeth. They had to grind their food up using that gizzard. God designed it that way. So when they would get an upset stomach, they wouldn't take Tums or Pepto-Bismol. They would swallow some more stones. And we can find these. I have some in my office, rounded stones that I found with the dinosaurs. They're all polished like they went through a rock polisher because they were grinding up vegetation in their stomachs. Camarasaurus and Diplodocus, again, they only had front teeth for the most part in Diplodocids, most of the long necks. Some of them had teeth, but they couldn't grind well. Now, the duck-billed dinosaurs could grind their food. The Triceratops, it could grind its food. But a lot of these Jurassic, a little bit lower level dinosaurs that lived at a little lower elevation probably, they actually couldn't grind their food up. So whatever they were eating, they had to swallow it whole for the most part and rely on their gizzards. Behemoth says, God goes on in Job 40:17, says, he moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. So here we look at these sauropods and we can see these big long tails that balance out the head and the neck. This one has a little longer tail than neck. A lot of them had longer necks than tail, but they're pretty much comparable for the most part. But this is a problem for people that try to say in your Bible, a lot of them will say crocodile or hippopotamus with a little note. Hippos have no tails like a cedar. Crocodiles don't really have tails like a cedar either. They kind of swing in the water. But these are something that swayed behind it as it walked back and forth, and the whole tail would sway and balance out the body as it walked from head to tail. So you can imagine these things really were the size of cedar trees. You know, if it was a smaller animal, you might have said the size of a willow tree. But God chose the word cedar, you know, these cedar trees. Apparently the Hebrew translation translate best as cedar. His bones are like bars of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. So the legs and the ribs on these animals, now the vertebrae were hollowed out, but the legs and vertebrae were solid. And you can see here's a femur bone, or the thigh bones right here, bigger than a human in these animals. You can see when you look at the thin section, you see how closely packed all the bone cells are. So the bones are very, very solid, like the Bible talks about. And the ribs are the same way. Here's the ribs of these things. You can see these ribs are busted. But you look at the bones, there's nothing hollow about them. They're solid. Very solid ribs, just like described in the Bible. And it says, Behemoth, he is first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring him near his sword. So these things got so big. When they got so big, even the T-Rex couldn't kill it. Just like today, very few animals are attacking adult elephants. So if you were big, you get to the point where you grew up and you were big, you were safe. So a lot of these dinosaurs got really big and they got really old, possibly hundreds and hundreds of years old, as I mentioned, just like humans in the pre-flood world, and very, very large. And they're basically immune to anything, even humans, even other dinosaurs. Only God can bring them down. And he did during the flood. He destroyed them all, except for the two that were on the ark. Behemoth says he lies under the lotus trees in a cover of reeds and marsh, so he lived in swampy areas. The lotus cover him in their shade, the willows by the brooks surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is undisturbed. The river can flood, but if there's a global flood, he is disturbed. So here's the sauropods, this little small head living amongst the reeds. After the flood, they lived long enough for at least God to point out to Job, this is a behemoth. Look what I made. First in God's ways. Behemoth is most likely a sauropod. Most scientists, creation scientists, we agree it's some type of sauropod. We don't know if it's a brontosaur or a patasaur. They're the same thing. Or if it's a brachiosaurus. It's not quite clear, but it's probably some type of long neck. Let's look at Leviathan. Leviathan's a little more questionable. I threw my hat in the ring of the Spinosaurus, you'll see, but my colleague, Dr. Brian Thomas, just wrote in the current issue of Acts and Facts about a new discovery in Deinosuchus, which is a big 35-foot alligator, or like crocodile type thing that had extra holes in its snout. And he says maybe those extra holes were something that allowed, let's go back. I think I destroyed the whole thing. Let's try it again. He thinks those holes were something that maybe allowed that smoke and fire to come out that the Bible talks about, which we'll get to in a minute. But it still could be this. It could be a Spinosaurus because they apparently swam in water a lot as well. Now here's what I talked about earlier. These are the coelacanths that they find. This is from the Morocco Spinosaur they found, which is a 45-footer, I believe, 43-foot long, bigger than the T-Rexes. And these are car-sized coelacanths, which only found in the ocean today 500 feet down or deeper. But at the time, since they're found with dinosaurs, of course, they think all these, including the swordfish down here, all these animals must have been freshwater fish, which is really circular reasoning because they find a dinosaur and anything found with it then must be freshwater as well, which I think is rather unscientific way to describe things. But those are marine fish mixed in with dinosaurs. And the Bible talks about Leviathan. Can you draw a Leviathan with a hook or snare his tongue with a line you lower? Just kind of talking about the size of this thing that you could throw a hook in there. It's going to do nothing. Here's the size of humans. And here's the size of these larger. There's some smaller ones as well, which God would have brought one of this size maybe on the ark. But there's the fully adult size. Leviathan, that will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power, his graceful proportions. Who can remove his outer coat? So he's actually very gracefully designed. But yeah, he's got a very thick coat, very thick reptilian type scales. Who can open the doors with his terrible teeth all around? So some of you are probably covering your eyes right now. It's kind of scary. That little girl is. She's covering. Oh, that's your mask. Okay. If you saw this coming up behind you and you were canoeing, I'd start canoeing a lot faster. Who can open the doors with the terrible teeth all around? So these animals had huge teeth on the top that come down. The crocodiles did too, but the Spinosaurus did as well. His rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. One is so near the other that no air can come between them. Again, they're difficult to kill these things when they're that big and they have these really thick scales. Some dinosaurs had over 40 layers of skin in those scales. Very, very difficult to try to put a spear into or an arrow. Out of his mouth goes burning lights, sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils. That's what they burning pot and burning rushes. And that's what Dr. Thomas wrote about it here, a new discovery about one of these crocodiles. Had a couple extra holes in its snout that I keep bumping this, and every time I do, we have to go back. Okay, so this is still a mystery. We haven't found a dinosaur or a crocodile that really shows evidence of this. But yet, just like the grass, people scoffed at the grass, dinosaurs eating grass. There was a discovery later that found sure enough, they did eat grass. And so the Bible says that these animals had some sort of sparks coming out or smoke coming out. I don't doubt God's word at all. There's something about these, whatever this Leviathan was, that was able to shoot out smoke or some sort of sparks. Exactly what, it's unclear. The Bible goes on, when he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid because of his crashings. They're beside themselves. So when this animal raised up on its back legs, it had two huge back legs, it would come crashing out pretty wildly and loud. Though the sword reaches it, it cannot avail, nor does the spear, dart, or javelin. He regards iron as straw and bronze as rotten wood, it says in Job 41, 26 to 27. So, as I mentioned earlier, if you're a human, you wouldn't want to live near these things, either in the pre-flood world or in the post-flood. So many of these, I think, were probably killed after the flood when they were juveniles. They didn't get as big after the flood. The conditions had changed enough that this is probably, animals like this were probably killed off as part of those dragon legends that the knights in shining armor were killing. They were probably killing off some of those dinosaurs after the flood. Goes on to say his undersides are like sharp potsherds. He spreads pointed marks in the mire. So this is what differentiates this animal from, say, a plesiosaur, a swimming reptile. Swimming reptiles had, fins and flipper type things. They didn't leave pointed marks in the mud. So it must have been something that had legs and feet that could walk and leave the pointed claw marks in the mud. So the crocodile, Deinosuchus, or this would both do that as well. But here I think the sail fin of the Spinosaur would satisfy this pretty well. He leaves a shining wake behind him because of that sail sticking up. One would think the deep had white hair. So as it swam along, it's going to stir the water up and basically make whitewater rafting possible. It's going to move so quickly through the water that's going to leave that white wake behind it. On Earth, there is nothing like him. Again, this is the largest dinosaur, meat eater anyway, although originally it was a plant eater, ever discovered. And so here's a human down there. This one's about 43 feet long, bigger than the T-Rex. And so on Earth, there is nothing like him which is made without fear. He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. So this is the largest, what became a meat-eating reptile ever discovered. And my wife and I wrote a children's book called Big Plans for Henry, and we throw a Spinosaur in there to introduce a little bit about the Spinosaur, a little dinosaur fact, and how it was eating fish and probably living in the river areas, but didn't maybe eat other dinosaurs. In the Discovery Center, we have one rearing up in the post-flood world room. You can see the mural on the wall where the Spinosaurus jumping up, and also the Behemoth. We have that over there as well. So if you get around the side of the T-Rex, look on the wall, you'll see these paintings that we put up there to show what's possibly Behemoth and Leviathan. So Job and the dinosaurs are most likely describing two massive dinosaurs. We have drawings and carvings of dinosaurs. You can see more of those in the Discovery Center exhibit. But in the book of Job, seems to be describing Job 40 and 41, two types of dinosaurs. Possibly a sauropod, possibly a Spinosaur. The book of Job was written around 2000 BC, most scholars think. And of course, the Bible is scientifically accurate. It's never wrong. You can argue it's not a science book, but when it talks about science, it's correct. Just like the dinosaurs did eat grass, sure enough, they found it. So I imagine there may be something we discover with all the soft tissues we're finding that may, sure enough, show that certain dinosaurs did have some sort of a gland of something to kind of shoot out fire or smoke of some sort. Dinosaurs were still active after the flood. And so at least through the time of Job, which had been about a few hundred years after the flood, you still had sauropods, Behemoth, you still had something like a Spinosaurus or a big, large crocodile, Deinosuchus, enough for God to point to Job and say, look at these things, look what I made, the wonders of my creation. And you, as humans, you are part of that, but don't forget what I did. And there's no ancestors to any of these. So, yeah, you can read a little bit more about even Spinosaurus and Behemoth. I have a couple of pages on some of these in my dinosaur book that's available in the gift shop over there. This is the Dinosaurs Marvels of God's Design book, which has got lots of wonderful color pictures in it. It's written at maybe a high school level, but a lot of you need to know more about dinosaurs. You have grandkids or kids that are asking you questions. You're like, I don't know. This is your resource. I spent a lot of time teaching an introductory dinosaur class at a college. I couldn't talk about creation, but I could talk about the lack of evidence of evolution, which I did. But in here we tie it into the Bible, we tie it into the ark, how they fit on the ark, and even where they lived and why we find them where we do, which is some of the research I'm working on now. Why do we find dinosaurs only in certain places in the world, not everywhere? In my home state of Michigan, there's no dinosaurs. We just find little marine critters. Well, why is that? Well, my research into the global flood is showing exactly why. There's areas where dinosaurs lived at a little higher elevation. And then highest elevation, there's where more of the mammals lived and probably the humans lived in separate areas. It's all about ecological zonation, I'm finding. And here's a little bit about, in that book, about Behemoth and Leviathan. It's a little bit about Leviathan, possibly Behemoth. And again, I'm not certain. That's why there's a question mark on there. It could be that Leviathan wasn't a Spinosaur. It could be it was a Deinosuchus. We're not really sure. But it seems to fit either of those. And there's that little Big Plans for Henry book my wife and I wrote. She should be the first author. She's a kindergarten teacher for many years and a first grade teacher for many years. So we wrote a story for kids about 4 to 7 that you can read. It's actually a little story. It's not just facts, it's a story. There's some facts in there. We snuck them in for the parents, but you don't have to read that. But it's kind of a fun little story. And you can tell, here's Henry right here, this little dinosaur and his mom, and you can tell his sisters are sisters because they have eyelashes. That's the key. We haven't found those yet on dinosaurs, but it's possible, but you never know. And then we have a wonderful video series if you never got a copy of this anywhere. It's a 4-part video series. I think they're all 22 minutes. And number 3 talks about those soft tissues, those original proteins that are found in dinosaurs and in other critters that go way back in geologic time, supposedly. But we believe they only go back 4,500 years, because that's what the Bible talks about when the flood actually occurred. And this is my last thing I'm going to plug. This is my newest book, which shows my research across 3 continents, North America, South America, and Africa. And I'm working on Asia right now. Since I wrote the book, I finished up Europe, and all the continents seem to be showing a very, very similar story. They all kind of start out slow, a little bit of flooding, just marine critters, and then eventually you get to the swampy critters like the dinosaurs at about the mid-level of rising, and then later you get mostly mammals. And so it isn't that animals evolved from marine animals. That was what was buried first. And I can show the maps where it was buried. And then you can see the progressive flood across all these continents. And we put that in that globe, but it goes in 2 minutes so quickly you can't see a lot of it. It's underwater. But in here you can actually look at the details, the actual rocks themselves, showing the evidence of a universal global flood. That's redundant, but it's true. You see every continent does pretty much the same thing at the same time, burying the same animals all over the world at the same level. There's no evidence of evolution. They just show up because that's the level they were buried at as the water rose higher and higher all the way up to day 150 till it went over the top. And then by day 150, if you weren't on the ark and you were a human living at that time, you were drowned. If you weren't an animal and you weren't chosen by God to be on the ark, you were drowned. And many of them became buried and locked in the stones and locked in the rocks for us to dig up and show the evidence of the flood is all around us. You can look down here in Texas and find fossils at our feet. That's the evidence of the flood. It's everywhere. So when people ask you, where's the evidence for the flood? Just say, look down. In most places in the country or in the world, the same evidence is going to be there. Just you're at different levels sometimes. But the evidence of the flood is all around us. God's word is true, folks. Everything God wrote down in that Bible that we hold so dearly. And none of us seem to read enough, myself included. But God's word is true, every word in there. So thank you very much for hanging in there today and sticking it out. I know some of you might have to get to the planetarium show in a couple minutes, but I think we have time for a question or two if you want to stick around, if you had the time.
All right. So if you have a question for the floor, just raise your hand. I'll need to repeat it for the microphone. But let's actually start with a question from one of our online viewers. What are your thoughts on the Loch Ness Monster, Dr. Clarey?
Well, I actually got a chance to go there about 10 years ago and looked at all the evidence and this and that. And I really don't think there's a lot of evidence of a plesiosaur like they kind of think it is. Even one of the pictures they kind of found it later was a hoax. And there might have been something swimming around there. Who knows? But I don't think it's, whatever it is no longer there. So I don't have a lot of faith in the Loch Ness Monster. But
all right.
Sorry to bust your bubble.
Yes, ma'am. Are we associated with Answers in Genesis in Kentucky?
Well, they actually, Ken Ham, who's the founder of that, he actually used to work for ICR. So, yes, we're friends with them, but they have a separate ministry than we do. Their emphasis is a little different than us. I think we emphasize a lot more of the research, which is what Henry Morris founded us on. Our science staff does, we really do a lot of research, but we cooperate with them on a lot of things. We collaborate on some things. We email back and forth and co-author some papers, but they have a separate ministry from us, and so we are separate. Yes?
And so do you agree with the ark and the animals that are on the ark, the way that's portrayed?
Well, everybody's got their opinion. I mean, we don't agree 100%, but he's got the general idea right. The size is about right, and the levels are about right, and so we agree with that. That's what the Bible says, and the animals on there, some of the animals I don't know if we agree with necessarily those particular animals they chose to put on there. I think I like the ones we have in here better as our representative types of animals. We're looking at the kinds, and so the animals, the lion you see in here is kind of a lager. It kind of has the ability to have the DNA to make lions and tigers and other cat animals from that one kind. And so sometimes you can get a little carried away. I mean, but it's up to the interpretive license to some degree. But for the most part, we agree with what they've put forth.
Yes, sir, in the striped shirt. Has the ark been found?
I don't believe it has. There's people that have claimed they found the ark, but I don't believe anybody's really found the ark. And I wrote an article about a year or two ago in Acts and Facts you can look up. I'm not convinced that the ark actually was landed on Mount Ararat. It might have actually landed a little bit to the west there, 70 miles west, because the Bible says the mountains of Ararat. And nobody really knows exactly which mountain it landed on. It might have landed at a lower elevation and might have, therefore might not have been preserved. It might have been used for maybe the first 50, 100 years for wood, because there wouldn't be a lot of big trees after the flood. So a lot of the humans and the first generation of humans after the flood might have kind of disassembled all the ark as well. But there's a hill that rose up right about the time of the high point of the flood, which I believe is around the Cretaceous level in the rock record that rose up. And even the secular scientists say this is a paleo hill. It never got covered by anything else. All the sediments were off to the flanks. And so it might have landed on that hill, which is now about 8,000 or 10,000 feet above sea level. And not quite as high. The problem with Mount Ararat is there's been a lot of ice age volcanic activity that built most of the mountain. So if it was there, it would have had to been when the mountain was very small, and then it grew during the ice age, which is after the flood. And so it would have destroyed or buried most of that ark that was there if it did land there. So I think there's a better chance that it landed a little bit to the west, about 70 or 80 miles. But I don't know for sure. I mean, nobody knows for certain, but it's the mountains of Ararat. And so Mount Ararat, keep in mind, was highly altered after the flood by the ice age. A lot of that mountain grew much bigger after the flood, so it wasn't that big at the time.